Welcome to another lecture in the series Striking a Chord, organized by the National Libraries of Malta. I'm Dr. Alexander Vella Gregory, and today I will be talking about discarded rituals. The Notarial archives in Valletta are home to a collection of liturgical music manuscripts which were reutilized as cover bindings for notarial deeds throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. There are a total of 32 such volumes, mostly in a reasonably good state of preservation, belonging to 13 different notaries from 1565 till the end of the 17th century. Why were these precious manuscripts discarded, and what can they tell us about the history of liturgical music in Malta? The accepted theory for the recycling of these manuscripts is that it was a direct result of the reforms of the Council of Trent in the 16th century that rendered these musical manuscripts obsolete. However, such a linear theory is a bit too simplistic and does not give a full picture of a very complex situation. There are strong indicators that the process of liturgical reform in Malta predate the Council of Trent, and there are several plain chant books, or at least sections thereof, which had already fallen out of use by the time the resolutions of the Council of Trent had actually become enforced in Malta. This practice seems to have been limited to Malta's main urban centres. In fact, there are 9 notaries from Valletta, 3 from Birgu and 1 from Mdina. The diversity of the styles of these manuscripts point to various sources being used for this recycling of manuscripts. This stylistic diversity is also corroborated by a set of 25 similar fragments held at MUΖA in Valletta. So far, no documentary evidence has so far been unearthed as to who procured and sold these parchments to notaries for reuse. In order to better understand the context for this recycling of musical manuscripts, a very quick look at the history of the liturgy is necessary. The liturgy within a Christian context developed organically over centuries, and that gave rise to a lot of variants and a lot of local traditions. Such traditions include the Ambrosian rite in Milan and the Mozarabic rite in the Iberian Peninsula. 2 rites in particular need concern us here: the Gallican rite and the Dominican rite. The Gallican rite originated in the area that is nowadays France. However, it refers to a collection of similar traditions rather than one uniform rite. Although it had been officially suppressed in the 8th century, it survived well into the 16th century, even in Malta, as we shall see later on. The Dominican rite, on the other hand, refers to the liturgy of the Order of Preachers, also known as the Dominicans, an order that was officially approved in 1216 by Pope Honorius III. It is very common for religious orders to develop their own liturgies and rituals. Some orders, like the Augustinians, adopted the Roman rite with only minor modifications. But others, like the Franciscans, the Carmelites and the Dominicans, actually developed their own specific liturgy. Although the Dominicans had their roots in southern France, they did not adopt the Gallican rite. In fact, they opted for the Roman rite quite early on. However, as we shall see through successive general chapters of the order, this choice and this liturgical development took a long time to develop. The other important factor in understanding these manuscripts is the Council of Trent, which took place between 1545 and 1563. Contrary to popular belief, this was not a direct result of the Protestant Reformation, but rather part of a much earlier process of liturgical reform within the Catholic Church. The most extensive mention of music in the liturgy comes from the 9th chapter of the 22nd session, held on the 16th of September 1562, which is worth quoting in full. They shall also banish from the churches all such music which, whether by the organ or in the singing, contains things that are lascivious or impure. This position would be encapsulated in the Apostolic Constitution Quo Primum issued by Pope Pius V in 1570. Despite making the Roman Missal the official liturgy of the Catholic Church, this decree also gave special dispensation to those rites which had been around for at least 200 years. This effectively protected the Dominican rite, and therefore it survived. The Gallican rite was afforded a little less protection, as unfortunately, because its early history was not well documented, it would have proved very difficult to determine which parts were at least 200 years old. Nor was this reform implemented swiftly. The earliest known partially reformed gradual was published in Venice in 1585, a full 15 years after the papal bull, and the first complete gradual only appeared in 1591. Nor must we discard graduals which were not reformed graduals, which were published after the Council of Trent had formally ended, including such ones printed in Venice in 1580. This mutual coexistence of diverse sources and approaches is precisely why there is no one linear theory to explain the recycling of musical fragments held at the notarial archives. We must now look at the state of the Maltese liturgy in the 16th century. Despite the evidence for the presence of an organized liturgy that goes back as far as the 13th century, the first concrete evidence for the teaching of plain chant to the clergy and the production or commissioning of musical manuscripts only goes as far back as the 16th century. Between 1527 and 1538, the Mdina Cathedral chapter commissioned local and foreign scribes to produce liturgical books. When Monsignor Pietro Dusina arrived in Malta in 1575, he interviewed several priests, and he found over a third to have an excellent level of education. Most of these were under 40 years of age. It was the older generation that tended to be a little less educated and in some cases even illiterate. This indicates a general improvement in the education of the clergy that started at least 2 decades before his visit. This could perhaps explain the flurry of liturgical activity that characterizes the early 16th century, with liturgical books being commissioned in abundance. This also means that certain manuscript folios ended up being expunged from the liturgy earlier than previously thought. Why would parts of the liturgy be expunged from the books? Well, Latin Christianity in Malta arrived under the form of Gallican Christianity, with the Angevin period in the 13th century. And as late as 1529, the Mdina Cathedral was still commissioning books, choral books written in the Gallican tradition. In 1575, Dusina also mentions a few of these Gallican traits, such as the presence of a votive mass to the Saint Amator, who was a Gallican saint not found in the Roman martyrology, or the practice of weighing infants at baptism so that the offering to the officiating priest was calculated accordingly. However, despite Dusina's references to these Gallican practices, there were actually very few priests following the Gallican rite. Indeed, Dusina found only 2 priests in Malta and 1 priest in Gozo, and it was only the Gozetan priest who was following the Gallican rite in all his ministry. Pope Pius V's bull of 1570 was enforced locally by 1571. Indeed, it was enforced by the vicar capitular Don Antonius Bartolo on the 23rd of May 1571. It effectively made the Roman rite the only rite in Malta. Did this mean that the papal bull caused the decline of the Gallican rite in Malta? Well, only 4 years separate the enactment of that decree and Dusina's visit, and that is a very short time for such a fundamental change to happen. In light of all this, the 1529 commissioning of books and the Gallican rite probably represented the end of an era, and by that time, the Gallican rite was already on its way out. This would also suggest that those manuscript fragments in the Notarial Archives collection, which have a Gallican connection, were probably obsolete much earlier than previously thought. Why is this Gallican connection so important? Well, at least in the deeds of Valletta notary Pietro Vella, the recycled fragments which were used for cover bindings contain chants which have a Gallican origin. The most interesting folio in this collection contains an example of a troped Gloria from the Ordinary of the Mass. We shall now hear a reconstructed excerpt. Spiritus et alme orphanorum paraclite, Domine Deus agnus nei filius patris, primogenitus Mariae Virginis matris, qui tollis peccata mundi miserere nobis, qui tollis peccata mundi suscipe neprecatione mea. The practice of troping in plain chant refers to the addition of music or text to the original plain chant. The additions in this particular example are in the manner of a versus or laudes, that is the addition of new text and music in between the verses of the Gloria. The additional text shifts the attention from the Holy Trinity towards Christ as primogenitus Mariae Virginis Matris, firstborn of Mary the Virgin Mother, and towards the Virgin Mary herself. These specifically Marian insertions point towards a Gloria intended for Marian Masses, although in all the available textual sources there is no specific feast attached to this Gloria. This chant has been traced in several sources, 5 from beyond the Alps and 1 from Portugal. Of these 6 sources, the Portuguese version has an altogether different melody, but the other sources all melodically match for the greater part. This indicates that this chant belongs to a tradition which is not a Roman tradition, but a Gallican tradition. This is further reinforced by the chant fragments on the same manuscripts within the same set of notarial deeds, which all have a Gallican source. Some of these chants also seem to be melodically unique. That indicates a regional or even a local tradition. The other rite that concerns us with this collection is the Dominican rite. The Dominicans in Malta were extremely well connected, and indeed they were very much present with the setting up of the Inquisition in Malta. Indeed, it was the Maltese Dominican friar Fra Damiano Taliana who accompanied Monsignor Dusina on his visit in 1575. Fra Taliana would also eventually set up the Valletta convent and be the first prior of the Valletta community, which is why we have chosen the Dominican church for the filming of the musical excerpts. Dusina visited a lot of churches around Malta, and towards the end of his visit he made a thorough inventory of the Church of the Annunciation attached to the Dominican Priory in Burgo. And there he notes in a terse one-liner that the Dominicans had one Roman missal. Clearly, the Dominicans in Malta, despite having their own rite, were also familiar with the Roman rite. This in itself is not proof that the Dominicans in Malta had abandoned the Dominican rite, but it does show that at least they were very much familiar with that rite. How does this relate to the chant fragments in the Notarial Archives collection? Well, there are several chants which seem to indicate a Dominican origin, but 3 in particular have a very specific Dominican connection. These are found on the covers of deeds by the notaries Salvatore Ciantar and Marc Antonio Ciappara, all working in Burgo in the 17th century. They contain chants from the divine office of St. Vincent Ferrer and St. Thomas Aquinas. The feast of these two saints is only celebrated extensively within the Dominican order, and they could only originate from a Dominican source. There are three chants. Two are antiphons for the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, Viror Carnis and Othoma Lauset Gloria, and another is a chant of as yet unspecified use, Predicator Vincenti, for the feast of St. Vincent Ferrer. The sheets from both volumes match stylistically, strengthening the case of a common source for all of these recycled fragments. Possibly the supplier worked in Burgos and possibly had a connection with the Dominicans in Burgos. We cannot exclude the possibility of some overzealous friar who, in a fit of reformatory zeal, started selling off chant books which he thought were now obsolete. However, this still poses a riddle. As we mentioned earlier, the 1570 decree of Pope Pius V had effectively given a dispensation for the Dominican rite. That means that there was no reason for chants of the Dominican rite to be thrown away. Secondly, the revisions of the Dominican chapter at Salamanca in 1551 had dealt extensively with the liturgy, but had left the feasts of these Dominican saints largely unaffected. The texts for these antiphons have also survived into more modern antiphonaries up until at least the 19th century. So why were these chants discarded? Well, the answer must lie elsewhere, and the clue is probably in the music itself. So far, no similar melodic sources have been found for these chants, presenting us with possibly unique chant melodies. This again could be proof of a regional or at least a localized tradition for these chants. And it would explain as well why someone would have thought these to be not conforming with the standard Dominican rite. We shall now listen to an excerpt from the chant Predicator Vincenti. Predicator Vincenti, Doctor Maxime, quem angelorum, cum ordinibus triumphantem, felices anime prosecuntur iucundus laudibus. The Notarial Archives collection is an invaluable source of information that offers new perspectives on Maltese ecclesiastical and musical history. It is clear that the linear narrative of recycling of manuscripts immediately following the Tridentine reforms is too simplistic and can be misleading. The recycling date of these folios is not necessarily the date for when these liturgies fell out of use, or when the actual volumes were discarded. There is a strong case for arguing that different folios were discarded at different times and for different reasons. Although the Maltese Curia had implemented the papal decree of 1570 within a year of its publication, there is enough evidence to indicate a much earlier process of reform locally. Despite some residual precedents of Gallicanisms in Maltese worship, these had all but disappeared by Dusina's visit in 1575. The Gallican chants found in these folios would have already fallen into disuse by the time of Dusina's visit. It would also explain why these handcrafted volumes were unbound and their sheets recycled so easily. By the 17th century, these liturgical books had been obsolete for decades, if not a century, which made them not old enough to be considered precious manuscripts, and yet not worth preserving or even correcting. Unlike the richly decorated liturgical books at St. John's Co-Cathedral and Mdina Cathedral, these either belong to an earlier time or were of inferior quality, and therefore amendments and corrections to these folios would have been too laborious. One also cannot dismiss the possibility that these folios provided additional income to those selling them off, an idea that is not implausible in a post-siege economy. Another fascinating aspect of these folios is the Dominican connection. At a time when the Dominican order was undergoing a process of liturgical reform that was independent of the papal curia. Some Dominican chants have proved to be unique melodic examples, possibly representing regional or even a local tradition. Such a situation is also found with other chants in the collection, and the possibility of other unique chants is strong. Whoever decided to start recycling these manuscripts has unwittingly preserved them for generations, allowing us to study these chants and saving them from ultimate destruction, and giving us valuable insight into this period of Maltese musical history.